I would like to, I'm Penny, and I'm the activities coordinator for Living Stones, which is the part of St Mary's Church here at Iffley that wants to learn more about the history and the purpose of our ancient and magnificent church. And each year we have a focus of something special that we want to find out more about. And this year's theme, which we started off being called the 12th-Century Renaissance, which was a very exciting idea and completely new one to most of us who are not actually medieval historians, has really grabbed clearly a lot of people today. So huge thanks to you for coming. And this is the first of 3 study days, really, looking at what was going on in the world near and far when Iffley Church was being built. How did those people tick? What on earth were they thinking about when they built Iffley Church? And one of the things they were thinking about is exactly what Claire said, that the Priory of St Frideswide was actually having a lot of new building done at the same time. And it does seem highly possible, not just speculation, that the same craftsmen were working in Iffley and possibly at St Frideswide's Priory too, which is an extremely exciting thought. And with that thought, I would like to start by introducing Andrew Dunning, who is our first speaker. Don't let me forget when I actually disappear that we lower the screen, okay? So Andrew Dunning is a curator of medieval manuscripts at the Bodleian Library, which, as he says, is your dream job. He's also a fellow of Jesus College, and I happen to know that he also manages to fit in time for his own research, which is what we're going to hear about today. And I don't think I need to introduce you anymore, apart from the fact that last week it was snowing where Andrew was, so you can find out where that was if you really listen. All right, Andrew, and I will lower the screen for you.
Well, it's such a pleasure to see you all here on this sunny afternoon to hear about the 12th century, which is, I think, one of the most exciting periods in history. It's this moment in time when we start to see all these things that become recognizable to us in the modern world that start to look like sort of like contemporary society. But at the same time, it continues to challenge a lot of our assumptions about what's relevant. People in the 12th century had really heated debates about matters that we would consider almost irrelevant today. And so that's what we're going to hear about with St Frideswide's Priory. And of course I couldn't, being a curator at the Bodleian, I couldn't start without a pitch for one of our exhibitions. These are free exhibitions, by the way, at the Weston Library. The one we have on right now is called Write, Cut, Rewrite. And it's a collection of authors' drafts from different periods. The very first item that you'll see on going into the exhibition is this utterly bizarre book. This is called the Ormulum, and it's the oldest autograph manuscript in the English language. It was signed by a fellow named Orm, and you can see that, by the way, all those black lines going through the text there, those are all his revisions. You can see these stuck in bits of paper here and there, and it's a great book to look at. And my objective today is actually to show you what the link is between this book and St Mary's Church. If you have looked at there's a wonderful, Penny gave me a copy of your wonderful book, and one of the first things it notes is that St Mary's in the Middle Ages was sort of operated by Kenilworth Priory. Now, Kenilworth Priory was also a 12th century creation, and it was run by the regular canons, which sounds like some sort of today what might sound like some sort of artillery maneuver. But let's unpack that term for a moment. Does anybody know, in the context of a non-military context, does anyone know what a canon is? Yes. I think, yeah, of course you've probably been a canon. Yes. But
are we talking about the regular canon?
the regular canon, exactly, yeah. So just ignoring regular for a second, what is a canon?
Well, canon is a clergyman, nowadays it's a cathedral, but I'm thinking of the canon. Sorry, I'm a medievalist, so we are.
Okay.
So it's a one-end canon.
What was that?
So that's a one-end canon.
Yes.
Or a two-end canon.
So
well, two-end rather than three, because you don't.
So a canon is exactly as you say. It's somebody. It's usually some sort of clergyman or clergywoman. There's also canonesses. It's usually somebody who lives according to a rule. Somebody's the Latin word canonicus is something that's following some sort of law. There's also canon law. And the term regular is, in the very literal sense, following a rule of life in that sense. And so the regular canons were the hot thing in the early 12th century because of this grows out of the monastic reform movement in the 10th and 11th century. The opposite to a regular canon in the 12th century is a secular canon. And so that's secular in the sense of living in the world. Before up to 1217, officially a secular cleric could be somebody who was married and had children, and so they had there's sort of a trend by the 11th century. There's this reform movement that often cast secular clergy as being these literally worldly people who sort of lived as they liked, and so there was St. Frideswide's Minster in Oxford was the predecessor to Christ Church. So before there was Christ Church, there was Christ Church was the creation ultimately of Cardinal Wolsey, who dissolved St. Frideswide's Priory, which is a house of regular canons, which was created in somewhere around the year 1120. That replaced St. Frideswide's Minster, which at least claimed to be the monastery that St. Frideswide, living in the 8th century, had created, which was probably, it's thought, there's very little evidence that survives about it, but it's thought to have been plausibly a double monastery. This is a really typical way of organizing a community in the Anglo-Saxon period. A double monastery would have both men and women living in the same community, although they'd be, of course, somewhat separate. And so the double monastery was replaced by the secular clergy who were given this reputation of just being these layabouts who didn't really accomplish very much. And so, following the monastic reform movement, there was people thought, okay, let's bring in these regular clergy who are people who live according. They're not monks, I should note. One of the most famous houses of regular clergy. Originally, this is the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great in London. And last time I was there, I saw a little sign saying that this was in the Middle Ages. This was run by monks. That's not quite accurate, and because they were run by these regular canons who followed the rule of St. Augustine. And what that enabled them to do is that meant that they had a pattern of life. And on every day, if you're a regular cleric, you're expected to get up at probably 5 in the morning, sing for an hour or two. You pray the service of the night office or matins. Following your big sing, though, you'd have communal meals. You're expected to live in a certain kind of way. But regular clergy weren't cloistered like a monk. And that's where the big difference is, because the point of the Augustinian canons, or the regular clergy, they were set up by Lateran councils in 1059 and 1063 as a preaching order or proselytizing order. The idea was that they'd promote Christianity within towns, especially in the first wave, as they were. And so they'd work as, you might have a regular canon who was working as a teacher locally. They might provide, in the case of Great St. Bart's, they were There's a hospital attached to it. So these were basically community workers. So really what this is an attempt to solve the age-old problem of how do you support what we would now call knowledge workers in a communal way. How do you get the maximum people in here without paying them fast wages, but ensuring that they have a way of sustaining themselves that allows them to focus on their work without a lot of bureaucracy, and being able to move these people around easily without being attached to a family. So that's the attraction of these people, and they're really. So St. Mary's is an example. This is a church that's operated by the regular canons. That would mean that they would be able to. Kenilworth Priory in the Middle Ages had the right to appoint the rector of St. Mary's, and they would have an influence over how these churches operated. So that's a background to what we're looking at. And so, as I said, St. Frideswide's Minster was replaced by when this apparently, according to historian William of Malmesbury, he says that the secular clergy there were living as they pleased. He says they were more or less good for nothing, and then they were happily replaced sometime around the year 1120 by regular clergy. And this, for William of Malmesbury, who by the way is a Benedictine monk, he thought this was fantastic. And the first prior of St. Frideswide, we don't know very much about him, but his name is Weemund. They say that he was a very learned man. He could apparently write brilliantly, but we don't know very much about what he actually did. We do know a lot more about the second prior of St. Frideswide, who was quite consequential for the history of Oxford. His name is Robert of Cricklade. In a lot of older, if you look his name up, you'll probably run across some 19th century literature that called him the first Chancellor of the University of Oxford. Of course, the University of Oxford didn't exist at that point, but that gives you a sense of his importance, at least. He was a writer. He was originally a school teacher, in fact, before he became an Augustinian canon, probably sometime in the 1130s. And he was originally so he became a regular canon. He's from Cricklade, which is in Gloucestershire, and he became a regular canon at Cirencester Abbey, which is of course a market town, and just up not too far from here in Gloucestershire. And so he became a regular canon there, and he wrote this book as part of his school teaching duties. This is an anthology of Pliny the Younger's natural history, and this is an example of the sort of thing he aimed to create. Basically taking ancient literature and trying to make it accessible to everyday people. Then he moved to Oxford and wrote this book called The Marriage of Jacob. This is a copy that's now in the British Library. Here's one that's in Oxford, which has some. This one was at Reading Abbey. You can see this person really liked this book. They've added all these nice little drawings in the margin. This is a passage that's talking about monasticism, and you can see that this on the top of this book, somebody's written ad claustrale, so add to people who are living in cloisters, and they have a nice little drawing here of somebody reading a book. There's a number of these drawings in the book, and so this is actually a handbook for monasticism, and he says himself, well, I am not a monk, by the way. I'm living what he calls a middle way, in fact. He says he's defining his place as not being somewhere in between these secular clergy and monks, but very definitely not either of those things. But again, this is actually a relatively popular book, and so we found there's copies of it that were in places like Reading Abbey, which is another Benedictine monastery. There was you could find a copy in the Middle Ages at Queen's College in Cambridge. This became sort of a response to work such as John Cassian's work on monasticism. So he wrote books like this. He wrote this book. This is a very nicely decorated book that was probably made in Oxford. In fact, in medieval Oxford, by the way, in late 12th century Oxford, the book creators were on actually where the old Bodleian Library is now, on Cat Street. And so this is probably, this book was probably made by one of those Oxford book decorators. So this is his attempt to create sort of a textbook of Christianity. It was meant to be a sort of a response to another book called Peter Lombard's Sentences, which, however, ended up becoming much more popular than this book. But he tried to create sort of the standard textbook of Christianity in this period. And then he went on, the most fateful thing he did though is that Robert of Cruthland loved to travel. And he went to Paris to see Peter Lombard, and he went to Sicily. Can anybody guess, why would somebody living in Oxford want to go on a trip to Sicily in this period? Any ideas? Yes?
There was a big hospital there.
So it was a
Hospital was there, one of the big hospitals.
yeah, so yeah, there actually was. There's a lot of. You're absolutely right that he was in fact partially going to get medical knowledge. So that's a really good guess. Any other thoughts about Sicily? Yes.
It's Norman.
It's Norman. Yeah. So that's a really. There's actually a lot more toing and froing between England and Sicily in this period than you might expect. Any other final thoughts on why? So basically, getting new knowledge, advanced, especially Greek medical knowledge in Sicily, and also interacting with your Norman colleagues. So Robert went on a big trip. He says he walked the whole way to Sicily. The official reason, by the way, was actually to visit the Pope in Rome, because the Augustinian canons, along with St. Frideswide's Priory in Oxford, there's also Osney Abbey, which was founded just a few years after St. Frideswide's, and they didn't get along, in fact. There's a huge, drawn-out series of legal cases. The two groups of regular canons fought for decades over who would run the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, just outside, which was at that point just outside the city walls. They both really wanted this church. They also really both fought over the control of Medley Island in Oxford. And so partially he went to Rome to try to bring forward this medical case, and he, again, walking the whole way. But of course, if you're going to go to Rome, you might as well go to Sicily. And so he looked for medical knowledge, he looked for other Greek books. He had a great time, by all accounts. There's this letter that's attached to a translation of a Greek philosophical text. And it's pleading Master Robert to just, why don't you just stay in nice sunny Sicily? We've got all the Greek books you want. You've got, there's nice people, there's gardens. Why would you want to go back to England? And, well, he did go back to England, and he probably regretted it, because on the way back, he caught he says that there was an ill wind blowing at him as he was walking along the coast, and he caught, and his foot swelled up. It's probably what he's describing is probably elephantiasis. And so he still managed to get back to Oxford, but his foot was swollen up. He says that, his greatest embarrassment, he says, was that he at Easter for a few years, he had to, when he's preaching on Easter Day, he had to preach seated, which was this horrible thing for him. But then, in the year 1170, we had the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. This is actually an illustration of that from a manuscript of Cirencester Abbey. And so this is this brutal event in which the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas, was killed by the soldiers of King Henry while he was celebrating Mass. And this event sent shockwaves through Europe. Thomas was immediately declared a saint, a martyr, and there's a cult of pilgrimage that grew up around Thomas, of people going on really big walks, basically, to seek healing at a shrine that was set up for Thomas. And so Robert was one of the people that decided this is perhaps not a bad idea. And there's a letter that survives in which he wrote a letter to a fellow named Benedict of Peterborough, who was one of Thomas's companions and created a huge book documenting all of the miracles that happened when people went to visit the shrine of St. Thomas. And so Robert says that he went there, he bathed his foot in, this is really weird, the monks at Canterbury would create this water relic of Thomas they would filter water through sort of tiny little particles of what was reputed to be the blood of Thomas. And so you'd end up with this little vial that would have just slight traces of the martyr's blood. And so he says he created a little bath with this, he bathed his foot in it, and he started going back to Oxford, and by the time he's back to Oxford, his foot had healed, he says. And this is fantastic, and this is probably what ultimately inspired the recreation of a cult of St. Frideswide in Oxford, because all of these books that Robert had been creating, they're all in a sense of trying to bring traditional knowledge, patristic knowledge of Christianity, these interpretations, to a somewhat wider audience. In Robert's case, a slightly more learned audience. But so Robert wrote a life of St. Frideswide, that is a story of Frideswide's life and the miracles that resulted. And then in the year 1180, just a few years after Robert died, his successor, Prior Philip, reopened this shrine of St. Frideswide. They had a big ceremony called a translation, which doesn't involve language. It's actually, in the very literal sense, just moving the relics, the bones of a saint, from one location in a church to another location, and to, in this case, a much fancier container. And this is an absolutely fantastic book. This book that we have here on the screen, this is a manuscript that's now in the Bodleian Library, and you have to imagine that this book was probably on display. You can actually see on the screen here, you can see that D. This would have originally been a bright blue, and it's now faded to sort of a very, very dark shade, almost black, probably because the book was perhaps laying out in the open for probably decades, if not centuries, and it probably faded to that color. You can also tell that this book was used at Christ Church. You can see this. Here's a little annotation in the margin that says the first reading. So this is they would read this book out loud. These miracle stories to inspire people to this is what happens when you visit our church. You'll also, by the way, sympathize with this person if you've ever studied Latin. Here we have right here we have MC. This is a Roman numeral. Somebody reading this book out loud had forgotten the Latin, so they were probably caught up at some point, and so they'd written into the margin millesimo, centesimo, so they wouldn't be caught out at a later time. So this is a fantastic manuscript for giving you a sense of what the regular canons were trying to achieve in Oxford. And I'll just, here's a sense, this is a picture of what Christ Church looks today, and this book, warning, I should say that I'm working on a translation of this book, so I'm partially trying to tell you on why you should read this, but this church here, you have to imagine, first of all, that the pews wouldn't have been there, and today, think of, you go into Christ Church, it's this really, it's this kind of, to me, it has a slightly boxed-in feel. But it's this very serene space. The sense that you get from reading these miracle stories is the complete opposite. There's people throwing up everywhere. There's people sleeping in the church overnight. It was total chaos, and they don't actually complain about it. So I'll just read you one selection from this text to give you a sense of what everyday life here would have sounded like. So this is the story of Margaret of Cullingburn, and I think you'll hear more about these people from Anne in a moment. So Philip writes, a clerk named Geoffrey from the village called Cullingburn had a daughter named Margaret. He had arranged for her to be married to a man named William from a village named Burgfield. She suffered from a spleen disorder for more than 2 years, and as time went on, she fell into such an infirmity that she could hardly do any work, hindered by weakness. But afterwards, as she lay in her bed of sorrow and her limbs slackened from the sickness, she came to the point of death and received extreme unction according to the Christian custom. So she was almost dead at this point. She was expected to die within days. She then recalled the virtues of our blessed and most glorious Father and martyr Thomas, that is Thomas Becket. So she was overwhelmed with the heat of her suffering. She vowed that she would visit his shrine if the compassionate might visit her in such a great illness. And immediately she began to feel better. She was therefore restored from that illness, and her strength gradually resumed. Her spleen disorder had not yet subsided when a headache and a ringing in her ears followed, so that, because of her great suffering, she both desired death and disdained life. For her body was worn out from too much leanness, and paleness filled her face. Her eyes did not see anything in life, and she could only breathe with pain and great suffering. Physicians sent her away without a remedy, and she was thought to be near death. So this, by the way, notice that this is a typical approach. If you get sick, people still think in this period, your immediate reaction is still to go to a doctor. You know, these are rational people. One night, as the rest of sleep refreshed her limbs, she saw a certain lady in her dreams with a most noble face and clothed in the whitest apparel. She encouraged her to go to a certain city unknown to her. There she might ask for treatment promising health if she obeyed this advice. Hearing therefore a report of the glorious Virgin Frideswide, she recalled the vision to her mind and remembered the advice. She interpreted the unknown city which she was urged to visit as Oxford. To offer an acceptable sacrifice to God and the Blessed Virgin, she decided to go to her church on foot. But too much weakness hindered her plan, and she completed it aboard a cart. Ideally, you would go on pilgrimage, by the way, on foot, but in this case, in some cases, as in fact Anne has discussed in a really good article, carts are acceptable too. And so you might, at this point, think that, okay, she's going to go to this church, she's going to be, maybe all alone beside this shrine. This was the image in my mind as I was reading this passage for the first time. And, so that this person at prayer, but what's going to happen next? When she was praying over the tomb of the Blessed Virgin, forced to allow herself the gift of sleep, she saw a certain lady of remarkable beauty and dignity, carefully going round the tomb to each of the sick people sleeping there, sprinkling their faces in turn, and afterwards wiping them clean. So suddenly you realize it's not just one person who's sleeping in this place, but a whole sea of people in that church. And you can imagine the smell of this. This is a really weird experience. But when the lady had come to her, she washed not only her face, but also her head, so that Margaret could see her, and the lady furnished her with a sign of the cross. When she awoke from this vision, she realized that she had recovered from all the pain in her head and the rest of her body. The next day, she who had been carried in a cart made a pilgrimage on foot, doing it the proper way, to the shrine of the most blessed martyr Thomas, rejoicing and glad, just as the same lady who had appeared to her had urged. She returned to her healer, the Frideswide, afterwards. When she visited, she was fully restored to health. So this is to me, I think, a great example. This gives you a lot of details that would tells you a bit about what everyday life would have been like in Oxford, what these regular canons at least aim to achieve, to have this church that was open to people, not just sort of not as sort of their church that would just be for them to sort of hang out and sing together, but as a building that would be something more like a hospital ward almost. So where yes, they would be singing every few hours, but there would also be tons and tons of people there all the time. And their ambition for the space was such that this is a seal that was created for the Priory, also sometime around probably about 10 years after that text was written, around the year 1190. And the funny thing is that this little canopy, so this is St. Frideswide, she's holding a lily probably in one hand, which is a typical sign of virginity, and she's holding over here, I think probably a set of wax tablets. And the wax tablets that was sort of the that's the equivalent of your iPad or your notebook today. This was specifically used for composing texts. And then above her you have this canopy, which is shaped just like the canopy at that's the sepulchre of Christ in Jerusalem. And of course, there's a lot of interest in traveling to Jerusalem in this period, but they were trying to compare this shrine of Frideswide to the actual tomb of Jesus himself. This is what they're aiming for. And so, alongside this ministry to Oxford and to what they hoped to be a much wider area, they also had various efforts at popularizing theology. So here we have the Ormulum again. So this is actually what that text actually is. That this is again that earliest English monograph that you can currently see at the Western Library. This is actually a series of versified homilies. So these are sermons to be read or perhaps recited out loud, and they're in English language, and they're trying to figure out how to bring again sort of traditional what would have at that point been considered to be actually cutting edge theology to a much wider audience. You might be perhaps it's not too much of a surprise that we have the oldest English manuscript in Oxford, the oldest English autograph in Oxford, but you might be surprised to know that also the oldest French autograph was actually written in Oxford. Alas, it's not here; it's in Paris. But this is a work by a fellow named Henrike, who was working around. He was in Oxford somewhere around the year 1214. He very, very kindly actually writes this colophon at the end of the manuscript saying, "My name is Henrike, and I wrote this at Oxford in the year 1214. So this is why we can say that this is an autographed manuscript, because he actually signed it." And this book, he says, going back to this page, he opens it saying, "Whoever you are, whether you're a lay, whether you're a clerk, listen to my story." And he compares this as a versification of a text, the Dialogues of Gregory the Great, and which is a great little collection of stories. They were often read as devotional reading during Lent, especially. And he's created this versified version because he says what he says is that he was concerned about people being who were enjoying the stories of King Arthur a bit too much. And so he's trying to create this version to sort of fill that gap, this desire for fun literature that would at the same time meet his aim of having something that's devotional. So that's an example of some of the things that some of the really innovative stuff that's coming out of Oxford in this period from the regular canons. They were also aiming to address scholarly audiences. This is, of course, just the beginnings of the university. There's a lecturer here called Alexander Neckham. This is a monument that you can see up to Alexander that's currently in the front hall of the Western Library. And he's the first person to call himself a lecturer in theology. He says he read publicly in theology in Oxford. This is in the 1190s. This manuscript here is actually stored almost underneath that archway. You could call this in a sense the earliest lecture notes from Oxford. It's a collection of lectures that he gave on the Psalms, and these are actually his annotations that you can see. He's working on this. I really like his little bubbles that he uses, and so he's annotating, he's expanding this text as he's giving these lectures. Now, following the 12th century, there's a lot. Certainly, the Augustinians became much less active. To some extent, they seem to have been replaced by the hot thing after the Augustinian canons were the Franciscans and the Dominicans and other preaching orders, and they in a sense, again, it's another attempt to try to, how do you sustain knowledge workers in a sense, as we now call them. And it's an attempt to have an even more sort of regulated form of these, and an even more sort of simplified version. The Franciscans, of course, in theory, weren't even allowed to own property of any form, but that's another story. once we get to in the 12th century, this is a period in which there's some really beautiful things being created. This is a psalter that was probably created, if not at St. Frideswide's Priory, then certainly for it. We have amazing buildings like Iffley Church, and all of this ultimately leads into the stories of the later Middle Ages and the way we now conceive of the modern world. Thank you very much.